Hello Proponomics people, and welcome to a longer form macro blast from the 9th of February 2024. Now today I wanted to use this slightly longer session to just reflect on what I feel is happening over a sort of medium term basis in the UK at the moment. I'm feeling it fairly significantly in my businesses, and I think that a lot of self-employed people will be feeling this quite significantly as well. So let's just have a quick rundown of roughly what's happened over the last few years. So obviously it's been a pandemic, there's been a huge amount of stimulus injected into the economy. Some people have taken significant advantage of that stimulus. Some people have not, unfortunately, and that's always the way. There's always opportunity in crisis. It's just as simple as that. For those who have taken advantage of it, perhaps they're now suffering and paying the price for it. I think that's the way of the general population to an extent. But in terms of what's been enshrined into legislation already this year, I think really where we're at, going from the 1st of Jan 2020, is very, very roughly, prices of most things are up about 25% and wages are up about 25%, certainly as of after this year's wage rise. So it's basically cancelled itself out. Property prices are up perhaps only 20% in some places, perhaps 30 to 35% in other places. So of course, like always, location, and it depends. But that's roughly where we're at. And once we get through the July energy price cap reduction, which is currently forecasted to be, hasn't been enshrined yet, of course, and if there's major changes in the Middle East or anywhere like that, then we don't know what will happen on that front. But looking at the futures at the moment, energy prices set to come down yet again, and that will take us to, guess where? About 25% more expensive than the start of the pandemic. That's roughly where we are. Now, there's a big disparity, and some things have gone up still far, far more than that. And certainly I would say construction cost inflation is more significant than that. But of course, that might be washing its way out at the moment as the construction sector is continuing to shrink at the moment. And that's the way it is. So I'm going to contend that, and I really, people who know, who listen to a lot of my stuff will know, I strongly dislike commentators who talk about recessions. I often say disparaging things about them, such as they've predicted 9 of the last 0 recessions, and they actually forgot we did have a recession in 2020. It was a very strange one. It was a very brief one. It was somewhat technical. It was also the biggest one we've ever had, because in one quarter, GDP went down 25%. But of course, the sticking plaster the government put over it, and also the economic bounce back and recovery, because of all of that stimulus, and because of primarily what Sunak did, which 80-90% of was actually really, really strong and really, really good, that he gets very little political capital or credit for, realistically, we bounce back significantly. And actually, as I've shared in the supplement a number of times over the past several months, there's an argument the cost of living crisis is over. But I also say all the time, we look at the wrong sort of statistics. And what do we look at? We look at GDP, because that's how we define recessions or not. Is the economy growing or not? Much, much, much more insightful to look at GDP per capita. So what do I like about GDP in general? It's pretty much the only high-level metric that actually takes inflation into account. Almost everything else that all of the big forecasters and the news outlets look at does not take inflation into account. And then it's spun in order to provide a media story to suit the narrative or the political leanings of the person writing it. That bit drives me absolutely mad. But we could improve on GDP simply by looking at GDP per capita. So we've had a recession in the UK. And not the 2021, the 2-quarter brief blip before the stimulus kicked in. We've had a recession. That recession is per head GDP, and that was shrinking significantly. What's the reality of what happened? The country imported 1.3 million net people in order to plug a gigantic gap in the job market. There were these huge number of vacancies. Businesses were struggling. Public sector services were struggling. A lot of public sector services have relied nearly solely on immigration, or at least heavily on immigration, for the best part of the last several decades, if nothing else. You have to go back to 1990, 91 to see immigration being as low as sort of 40, 50,000 a year in the UK. And why was that then? Because there was a terrible recession going on, apart from anything else. So people don't want to come to countries that are having terrible recessions. But really, we've had this recession, and we as the people, of course, like always, are paying for it. Now, how are the self-employed and the employed paying for it, apart from anything else? Because it's all very well for me to say prices up 25%, wages up 25%. So you're okay, PAYE people, but you're not. Because ultimately, if that's tipped you into the higher rate tax threshold, which is expected to do for 4 million people, I think it'll be more, because I still think inflation's got a sting in the tail. 4 million more people by 2029, than before the start of the process will be in the higher rate tax bracket. So instead of paying their 32%, which is now 30%, thanks to Hunt's recent budget, in fairness, go to paying 42%. So an extra 10% in old money, 12% extra in new money in tax. And this is us providing that long, soft cushion, and it's smoke and mirrors. And it's really annoying and disappointing. Now, I think the self-employed are taking it even harder because ultimately they suffer the same problem from the tax thresholds, but they're also coping with higher dividend taxes. So national insurance does not necessarily help the self-employed. And who's going to feel sorry for people who take money out of their companies in efficient fashions through dividends and things like that? But the dividend tax wasn't cut back when the national insurance rates were cut back by a couple of percent at the basic level. That was really quite mean and unfair and just a way of trying to rebalance the books. But now the self-employed pay more tax at the under 50k level. And remember, the average self-employed person is earning about half of what the average employed person is. And what does that tell you? Well, it tells you that they choose to be self-employed for flexibility and lifestyle reasons. Not they choose to be self-employed because it pays so much more money. And a lot of the self-employed are the backbone of the economy. The tiny little businesses, the one person band who provide critical services all over the place in the economy. They're just taking it in the face more than anybody else. And that doesn't feel right to me. So I often talk about inflation like carbon monoxide. And this is really prolonged exposure. We've got the window open, a tiny crack at the top, so we can just about stay alive. That's the way we are at the moment. And that's before we hit the austerity poison pill that's in the system, thanks to Liz Truss and then Jeremy Hunt sweeping up of Liz Truss's awful work. We've got this poison pill in the system. So you can probably tell I don't envy the next governmental administration that's coming into power, but I do think there's not enough fuss being made about this. And as inflation carries on, and again, with my tinfoil hat on, I'm one of the ones saying the government loves a bit of 3 to 4% inflation, so they really don't care if we're well above target. 2010 to 2019, supposedly low growth, low this, low that, 2.7% average inflation. Lovely business for the government, just slicing the top off the people, little bit by little bit, shaving more and shaving more and shaving more. And actually the government have had a significant saving in the past couple of years, thanks to what happened with COVID. Not a lot of it was avoidable. I don't think the lockdowns were done very well at all. I think the first lockdown was justified too late and also opened up too late. But of course, that is hindsight to an extent, although I was saying these things at the time. The other lockdowns were a complete mess and should never have happened. And it was simply people feeding at the trough, the likes of those that you've seen in the news with their £100 million plus PPE companies who are now getting held to account. There's too much crony capitalism going on and overall terrible behaviour, as we now know, because of things like the COVID inquiry. But there we are. It happened. We have to recover. We have to have a mentality that takes some time for a country to recover. Instead, it gets swept under the carpet. And I think the wrong people are feeling it. And I think what we're going to see is the wrong cuts being made in an austerity environment, because ultimately the Labour Party have already realised they can't come into power. They're already scrapping £28 billion worth because the Conservatives crashed the economy, except that's not really a very good phrase because the economy hasn't crashed by all the metrics we've used. It's just suffered a bit and it's gone backwards and nobody likes that. And if they were making more of a meal out of GDP per capita and things like that as the right metric, they could actually back up their claim rather than making these high-level sound bites. But there you go. We're going to have a pretty dull year in terms of electioneering because it's going to be the devil versus the deep blue sea. It's all going to be more of the same. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing because this will be the worst system and the worst two opponents apart from all of the others. You know, at least Corbyn is nowhere near office because that would have been a true economic disaster and meltdown and probably offered up Britain, the UK, for the taking to anybody who was aggressive enough to invade us apart from anything else while we were busy turning the other cheek. But there we go. That is my rant for the day. I feel a bit better for getting it off my shoulders. But if you hear me talking about the Great Pillage or similar from now on, I'm still searching for the right name for it. But the Great Pillage is that money all coming out of our pockets due to these frozen tax thresholds. And I think fundamentally it's wrong.